Hello, I know it has been quite a while since I've done this, but we're back with another episode of the Real Stories series. This is the second and final part of Billy Kimber's life story. If you have not watched part 1, I highly recommend you do so first, and I'll link it in the description down below. So we left off with Billy and the Birmingham Boys becoming one of the most powerful gangs in England, just before the beginning of World War I. 1914 is when the details begin to get slightly foggy. As you will all know, 1914 was around the beginning of World War I, and when the war began there was a complete closure of all racecourses over the duration of the war. This meant that Billy Kimber would have had to stop his business with the racecourses and move elsewhere. It was said that he enlisted in 1914, but any details of him during the war or even when he returned home is unknown. It is said that he may have been discharged or left in 1915, but other sources say that he served for the majority of the war. With the racecourses reopening at the end of the war, business was booming. The UK was known for having a large economic boom after the war. This was due to a private capital that pent up over the 4 years of war, which was now being invested into the British economy. At this time, you had a large portion of stressed, tired and depressed men and women suffering with coming to terms with normality after the war, so it comes as no surprise that they all flocked to the racecourses to relieve some of their stress. With the rail expansion, it allowed Billy Kimber and the Birmingham Boys to travel further from race meetings and to form more allies with other gang members. He set up a second base in Islington, North London, and lived with his girlfriend at the time, Florence Brooks. Once again, Billy decided to form alliances rather than fighting for dominance straight away. His previous alliance with Charles Wag MacDonald and the Elephant and Castle gang was stronger than ever. His activity around London once again drew the attention of Sage, his old friend from prison who was living with an acquaintance of Billy's. The alliances that Billy formed were strengthened by a common enemy. The Sabinis were an Italian mob run with an iron fist by Charles Darby Sabini. They controlled the southern London racecourses, Newbury, Epsom, Earls Park and Kempton, and were in alliance with the Solomon brothers, who held heavy influence with the Jewish bookies. You may recall Alfie Solomons from Peaky Blinders, played by Tom Hardy. He is in fact a real person, although his last name was Solomon rather than Solomons. When Billy arrived in London with his men in tow, he made quite a show. Whether to make a mockery of the Sabinis or to assert his dominance, his house was just a mile away from the Sabinis' base. While the Sabinis had controlled the racecourse with force and destroyed all predecessors, Billy was not fazed in the slightest. Kimber wasn't impressed or scared by Sabini or his gang. He wanted what they had and he set out to get it. One of the main issues Kimber faced was that the Sabinis' gang held power over the police force through bribery and corruption. Billy and his gang were new to these streets and did not hold that influence, which would make their dealings more difficult. By 1921, Billy had weeded out the smaller gangs that would try and push their way into the scene. The conflict between the Sabinis and the Birmingham Boys remained fairly dormant until Alfie Solomon shot one of Kimber's men at a race. You could say that this was one of the turning points of conflict. Kimber then increased the amount of men that were attending these meets and Battle of Bath began. Kimber didn't like how Solomon practiced their work. Instead of convincing bookmakers to take protection, the Solomons would threaten them at knife point. This led to one occasion where Alfie Solomon was badly beaten by the Birmingham Boys. This in turn made the Sabinis and other Jewish bookmakers want revenge. Violence broke out at several meets, with the Birmingham Boys, Sabinis and the Solomons always at the centre. This diminished any possibility of finding a peaceful solution between the gangs. Eventually both sides had come to a standoff, with heavy casualties being reported on both sides. The general public were also crying out for the police to suppress the violence often occurring at the racecourses. It only got worse when on the 23rd of March an incident was reported where a small group of the Birmingham Boys had attacked Charles Sabini in Greenford. In an attempt to escape, he pulled out an unlicensed 5-chamber revolver and fired into the open. The Birmingham Boys backed off when it caught police attention. Sabini escaped with minimal beatings and was released from police custody on terms of self-defence. On the 27th of March 1921, in an attempt to take control of the situation, Kimber visited Charles Sabini at his King's Cross flat. It is speculated whether Kimber went with honest intentions to form a truce or if he wanted to rub salt in his wounds. The meeting seemed to have been going peacefully until Alfie Solomon arrived at the flat. It is said that Kimber had an extreme hatred for Alfie and saw him as scum. Either way, Kimber went to fight him, and instead of fighting Kimber, who could win a fight, Solomon pulled out his gun and shot him. It seemed that Sabini had not invited Solomon to this meeting, as Solomon was forcibly removed from his flat by his men. He returned some time later and local residents said that they were social throughout the night. Kimber was then found laying outside on the street where a passerby found him with a hole in his side. The bullet had gone clean through. He was taken to hospital where he luckily survived. Solomon turned himself over to the police and claimed it was an accident. He was charged with unlawful wounding, but Kimber refused to say anything about what happened. Solomon's case was then dismissed on April 27th due to lack of testimonies. Tension was at an all-time high. The meeting between Kimber and Sabini showed that there was no hope of a peaceful outcome, and the Birmingham boys were keen to take control and end the bloody gang wars. While Billy was recovering from his wound, he had shared his plans to target the Sabini gang on the first day of Epsom Derby with George Brummy Sage. The night before that year's Epsom Derby, one of the members of the Birmingham boys was attacked in Covent Garden by a few of the Sabinis. It is reported that he needed 70 stitches due to the brutal attack. The Birmingham boys began planning with Sage at their side. They knew that their rivals would be out in high numbers, as well as the Metropolitan Police. So to avoid confrontation with the law, the Birmingham boys left the race early. They drove away in a very conspicuous vehicle, a bright blue charabanc. So a charabanc is like an old-fashioned people carrier. It was long and could be open top and was primarily used as a transportation vehicle like a taxi. They had driven down the road leading from the Derby and hid it behind some bushes, where they would lay in wait for the Sabinis to pass at Ewell, a few miles from Epsom. The spot they chose on the main road leading from the Derby, meaning it was very unlikely that Sabinis would go in a different direction. Two cars approached and the Birmingham boys were ready, makeshift weapons in hand. They positioned so that when the cars got close enough, one of the Birmingham boys would pull their car out from behind a bush and block the road. The rest of the boys would wait in ambush and run behind the vehicles, leaving their targets no escape. Weapons in hand, the Birmingham boys set to work, first beating on the vehicles and then on the stunned occupants. They were dragged to the floor and beaten bloody. The Birmingham boys used guns, hatchets, house bricks, iron bars, knives and razors. It was absolute carnage on the streets. Motionless bodies littered the floor. The Birmingham boys had revelled in their victory, but only for a moment, for one of them realised, shouting out in anguish, that this was not the Sabini gang. They had beaten up their own allies, the Leeds mob. Luckily, nobody died during this incident, although a lot of damage had been done. The 28 Birmingham boys tried to run away from the scene in their bright blue charabanc. It was almost like they were asking to be caught when a few miles down the road they decided to stop by the George and Dragon pub and have a few drinks. I couldn't find any reason as to why they did this. Maybe they were cocky, maybe they thought the police wouldn't chase gang on gang crime, but either way, stupid move. But soon after, a man called Sergeant Dawson stepped outside the pub. He had planned carefully before entering the building. Two of his men were set to take out parts of the car entrance and none of them had a getaway vehicle. Then they covered all entrances. Sergeant Dawson entered the pub first, calmly drew out his revolver and stated, "I should shoot the first man that tries to escape." He held the entire group of 28 Birmingham boys at gunpoint until backup arrived. 26 of those arrested stood trial. 23 of them were convicted to sentences between 9 months of hard labour and 3 years imprisonment. This takedown of the Birmingham boys set the police in motion, cracking down harder on racetrack wars. It wasn't the end of all racetrack racketeering, but it did diminish their presence at meets. So with the Birmingham boys now depleted in numbers, Charles Sabini had stepped up to reassert his dominance in London. And now there isn't much said about Billy Kimber after this. It is speculated that he fled abroad to visit his friend Charles Wag MacDonald, who is now a bodyguard to Charlie Chaplin at the time. Okay, so that is all I know about the life of Billy Kimber, so I really hope you enjoyed it, and as for my next Real Stories video, I will put up a poll on my Twitter on 3 people that I have in the running, so if you'd like to go vote on that, the link is in the description. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.